Far too often nowadays we see once great developers settle for creating mid-quality games, due to their names carrying a certain level of credit and reputation. A reputation of once being passionate and dedicated companies built on the sole purpose of wanting to create games that pleased fans, rather than fill their pockets with sweet moolah! Obviously, a company is always going to be driven by money, but when that becomes more important than delivering a high quality game, then they deserve all the backlash that comes their way. With how common of an occurrence this is, I feel like we have to give credit to developers like id Software for continuously keeping up to their high standards. It seems like people take id Software for granted, which is even something that I have been guilty of. Up until recently, I had never really paid attention to this team, which was pretty ignorant considering these guys defined the FPS genre during the 90s. Doom changed my whole outlook on them, as it is now one of my favourite franchises thanks to its addictive gameplay, epic visuals, and its endless amount of bangers. It was this newfound love in my life that encouraged me to discover other franchises they were responsible for creating, which led me to purchasing and downloading one of their most interesting IPs, Quake. However, interesting isn't used in the conventional sense. Usually when describing a franchise as interesting, people use it to describe components like the story, gameplay, or even the world of a specific video game, and although Quake games have these qualities, what's most interesting to me is how different a lot of the games in the series are from one another. Quake's identity crisis can be seen as early as the first game to be released in the series back in 1996. Early concepts for Quake had it envisioned as a fantasy role-playing game, however many personnel at id felt that Quake needed that Doom charm of violence and gore, as it would set the game apart from others on the market. Id saw themselves as specialists in the field of fast-paced, endless action games, rather than story-driven, slower-paced games, so they ultimately decided to play to their strengths. Their current engine was not enough to realise their creation, however, so they built a new one titled the Quake engine. Whereas the classic Doom games did have 3D environments, the environments are projected from a 2D floor plan, which meant id couldn't experiment with level design as much as they would have liked. This new engine, however, let them use true 3D real-time rendering, giving Quake slick and modern-looking visuals. Speaking of the game's visuals, there is a noticeable disjointedness between a lot of the levels in the first Quake game, which is due to the fact that there were 4 level designers working on the game who were all encouraged to do their own thing. In order to make these design choices somewhat cohesive, id Software decided to split the game into 4 sections. The objective in each of these sections was to retrieve the rune at the end of every last level, in order to fight the giant hentai monster at the end of the game. Another reason why the game feels so all over the place is because there is a large variety of enemies, ranging from soldiers with guns, evil knights, zombies, angry fish, angry sperm, and other creepy monsters. I think a lot of people downplay just how much of an impact Quake has had on the gaming industry, and id Software as a whole, as it isn't as mainstream as the likes of Wolfenstein and of course Doom, who have both received numerous entries in their franchises over the past few years. But Quake has been key in pushing this development team forward. Quake was the first game created by id Software that included vertical aiming into its gameplay, allowing the player to raise and lower their sight onto an enemy, as opposed to the Doom and Wolfenstein games that came before, that only allowed the player to look left and right, and compensated for this by being a lot more lenient with where the player needed to aim in order to actually hit an enemy. The series also pioneered movement mechanics such as bunny hopping and strafe jumping that would later become staples of other franchises. This meant that in a way, Quake required more skill to master, as players had to learn these at the time brand new and alien mechanics, and this new layer of gameplay also meant id Software could improve another aspect of gameplay they introduced in Doom, but because of technical limitations was still very raw: multiplayer. Quake's multiplayer game mode became an instant hit amongst loner millennials due to its high-speed gameplay and over-the-top action that gave Quake both a casual and competitive appeal. This new sense of direction would be followed up in the sequel Quake 2, as id Software decided to go for a more focused design for the game, giving it a true sci-fi aesthetic, with new enemies and a more cohesive story. Once again though, this aspect of Quake was overshadowed by the multiplayer side, thanks to its chaotic nature. Quake 2's multiplayer is probably more well known for its most exciting attribute, which is of course its mods. It wasn't long before dedicated fans created their own maps, tools, and game modes to further solidify Quake 2's status as one of the best multiplayer shooters to ever exist. And after seeing this, id Software decided to put all their eggs in one basket, making their next game, Quake 3 Arena, a multiplayer-focused game. id Software was so proud of this game and its success that they made another Quake 3, Quake 3 Team Arena, which was basically the same game, but with teams. Yeah, this game didn't do too well, mainly because people weren't willing to buy a game that was pretty much identical to a game that they already had. I guess we should be thankful that nowadays it's uncommon for developers to copy and paste their games, while still charging full price for them. Then came the topic of today's video, Quake 4. Quake 4 was a return to id Software's focus on single-player content rather than just multiplayer. Whilst Quake's signature action-packed multiplayer was present in the game, devotion was clearly put into making the single-player experience as interesting and enjoyable as possible. Quake 4 is a direct sequel to Quake 2, as id Software believed Quake 3 was a direct sequel to the original Quake. Yeah, it's pretty confusing. The reason behind this is because several employees who worked on the franchise wanted the original Quake 2 to be a completely different IP, with early ideas having the game being called War, but for whatever reason they decided to make it a Quake game, and so Quake 4 carries on the same ideas implemented in the second game, depicting the intergalactic conflict between humanity and the Strogg. id Software technically did not make this game, however, as Raven Software were responsible for development, whilst id Software supervised their progress. They also provided Raven with the id Tech 4 engine, which was the same one used to create Doom 3. As well as sharing the same engine, Doom 3 and Quake 4 are very similar in terms of visual style, as both represent a more serious and dark version of their respective universes. But it was decided that Quake 4 would lean more into being a sci-fi shooter rather than a full-blown horror game like Doom 3. But that's not to say that the game didn't have its creepy moments. Despite id Software taking a risk by bringing the game back to its roots, it was still very successful, going gold in October of 2005. Whilst many fans of the game obviously wouldn't have forgotten about it, the way the franchise has evolved and changed since Quake 4's release makes me think that id Software have chosen to forget about it, as the last few Quake games have been multiplayer-based shooters, with the latest game, Quake Champions, focusing yet again on arena-based multiplayer, and scrapping single-player altogether. To die-hard veterans of Quake, this might not be so bad, because for a lot of people, it was the multiplayer that brought them to Quake. id Software have proved time and time again that they can make great multiplayer experiences, but the new Doom games have also proved that they have a knack for storytelling and world building, and if Quake does receive a new game, which let's be honest, it probably will, I would love it if this new game was a sequel to Quake 4, because despite the game's shortcomings, it has a lot of qualities that make it an enjoyable experience. The game takes place during the second invasion of the Strogg's homeworld, Stroggos. This links to Quake 2's story because the first invasion of the planet was present in that game, however the defences on the planet were too strong, and so most of the human forces were killed off, save for one ranger who you play as throughout the game. The protagonist of this game, Matthew Kane, is involved in the second assault of Stroggos, and you and your other super sci-fi soldiers are on a seek and destroy mission, searching for the Nexus, the supposed winning component that has turned the tide of the war in the favour of the Strogg. The game works on an objective to objective based formula, having you and other generic space dudes go behind enemy lines to destroy important Strogg compounds and equipment, gradually taking control of the planet. What most id games have taught us is that their protagonists usually don't have a lot to say, and Kane is no different. Kane is used more as a vessel for the player to inhabit during the game, making you take a step back and watch as events unfold in front of you. This lets you get invested in the world of Quake as you get drawn in by the over-the-top and often humorous supporting characters. Whilst Kane is the main part of the story, the other NPCs steal the show. Although the characters are entertaining, you don't get emotionally attached to them, as they're pretty much there to fill the gaps of generic army stereotypes. You can tell this is an early 2000s id Software game when Steve Blum voices almost every background character.
I heard the Strogg attacked Earth because it's a strategic location. Corporal, I'm a little preoccupied at the moment. Sorry, I'm kinda occupied right now.
Name and rank, soldier!
The most interesting thing, in fact probably the only interesting thing to happen story-wise, is when Kane gets partially converted into a Strogg. The Strogg themselves are kind of a mystery, as their origins are not made clear over the course of Quake 2 or 4. What is known is that they are a semi-cybernetic race that reproduce by taking biological beings and fusing them with Strogg technology, turning them into violent amalgamations of flesh and metal. This wasn't translated very well in Quake 2, as the enemies you fought in the game just looked like generic cyborgs. However, the power of the id Tech 4 engine allowed id Software and Raven to get creative with both classic and new aliens, making them look 10 times more terrifying than they were in the previous game. Once you were captured, you were taken to a stroggification center where you were treated to a first-person view of yourself getting mutilated. Watching these rusty, bloodied saws and clamps hack away at your body is pretty disturbing. Before you can be fully converted, however, your comrades storm the facility and release you, and after they see your new body, they begin to question your loyalties. Nah, just kidding, they forget about it fairly quickly. I get that the story of an id Software game is never really the main attraction, but they could have made something really interesting with Kane's character, now possessing certain Strogg traits. But like before, Kane is just used as a tool by his superiors, as he now has the ability to interact with Strogg technology. It doesn't really do much story-wise, it's more so used to add a new layer to the gameplay. Like I've said, id Software technically didn't develop this game, but they were in charge of supervising its development, so any decisions Raven made, they would have given the green light for. This additional team may have been a blessing in disguise for id Software, because it was definitely the most ambitious title attached to their name at the time. The spirit of the classic games is still there, but there is a noticeable change in some of the gameplay. The combat is incredibly satisfying and addictive, and it definitely feels like a step up from Doom 3. A big problem with that game was that some of the guns felt unresponsive and underpowered, which should be criminal for an id Software game. Gunplay in Quake 4 is snappy and impactful. You feel the weight of every projectile and bullet you fire, which was desperately needed as this game is much more action-packed than Doom 3, meaning if the issue remained, it would be a lot more prominent. You can't have an id game without weird monsters. The amount of variety in terms of the creatures you fight is very impressive, as they all serve unique roles in the Strogg army and have their own attack strategies. Some attack you by utilising their body strength, charging you down and crashing into you. Some use melee attacks to stun you and deal huge amounts of damage, and some even give you bonus. But most of the Strogg use guns ranging from shotguns, rifles and rocket launchers, depending on the size of the Strogg. Whilst there are a large number of enemies in Quake 4, most of them can be beaten the same way, because a lot of the guns in this game are very effective. The shotgun is yet again another great all-rounder, absolutely decimating anything 2 meters in front of it and still doing decent damage from afar, like the good old Quake 1 days. Most of the weapons in the game are returning favourites, like the nail gun and the hyper blaster, but Quake 4 introduces a brand new beast into its roster, and that is the BFG, the Dark Matter gun. Needless to say, Quake 4 replicates the chaotic combat of past Quake and Doom games, but like Doom 3, the gameplay has evolved in different ways. A big catalyst for these changes is due to its level design. id Software realised that the close quarters action formula was perhaps not getting stale, but a bit repetitive, and so with the help of Raven, wanted to add another dynamic to the level design that would open up the possibilities for combat. Id really wanted to push the boundaries with their engine, and it shows with just how much larger the game feels than Doom 3. Many of the levels have large playable areas, making the human and Strogg conflict feel like an actual global conflict, rather than a couple of dudes shooting each other in a corridor. The game has a lot of interesting mechanics that make it stand out from not just the Quake series, but Id's other games. A big reason this game isn't nearly as scary as Doom 3 is thanks to the NPCs. For once, the generic soldiers in a game are actually competent and don't die en masse. Well, a few die here and there. This guy even died from a stroke, it seems. During certain segments of the game, NPCs follow you through levels, and although it's mostly scripted, because it only really happens during key story plot points, it's a nice change of pace as you don't have to fight enemies all by yourself. Quake 4 has a lot of great elements in its gameplay, and I would love to just leave it there, but unfortunately, there are a few things that just don't work. Anyone who has ever played an id Software game knows that a big piece of their gameplay style is speed. Fast-paced, non-stop action. Well, it seems in an attempt to subvert expectations, Kane forgot about leg day and runs about as fast as a snail. I don't know why they decided to make you move so slow, because it really makes no sense for the style of gameplay. Even Doom 3 lets you move faster, and that game is supposed to be a slower experience. This was probably the only bad mechanic in the game, but there are others that just don't work too well. At set points in the game, some of your weapons receive upgrades that unfortunately don't feel like they change all that much. Besides the lightning gun, that upgrade absolutely kicks ass. This feels like a missed opportunity to let the player choose for themselves which guns they want to upgrade. The biggest letdown with the gameplay though has to be Kane's Stroggification. The Strogg are shown to have some really unique abilities, so when you get given this Strogg technology, you think you're going to get some of these perks, but all you actually end up getting is the ability to move slightly faster and drain these ball sacks for health. Nice. I know I may be in the minority when it comes to my opinion on Quake games, but I enjoy mowing down aliens rather than sweating my dick off in a fast-paced arena battle. I get that Quake is just one of those games where the multiplayer is so much more popular thanks to its roots and significance throughout gaming history. After all these years though, Quake 4 feels like wasted potential, especially considering the fact that a sequel was teased at the end of the game, which could have given us more insight into the Strogg, and showed off more of Kane's powers, but I don't think id Software has any interest in revisiting this part of Quake's DNA. Although Doom did get rebooted, so who knows, the next Quake game could be reminiscent of Quake 2 and 4, with the addictive multiplayer of Quake Champions. And for the love of God, please, please just give us Orb back.